Shalom Aleichem. Good Yontev, Chag Sameach, and Happy Purim. My name is Lisa Roy. I'm the manager of Adult Daytime Culture and Education at the Miles Nadal JCC in downtown Toronto. I'm so thrilled that so many of you are joining us. 122 people registered to have fun with us this afternoon. I see so many familiar faces, and an extra special welcome if you're joining us for the first time or from JCCs across North America. How wonderful for us to be gathered together today for our virtual Purim event, the Purim Shpiel Throughout History, with guest speaker Miriam Borden. I would like to extend my heartfelt thank you to our event partner, the UJA Committee for Yiddish, for generously co-sponsoring today's program. We greatly appreciate you keeping your microphones muted. I encourage you, turn your cameras on, open your chat bubbles. If you have a question for Miriam or a positive comment during her lecture, kindly type it in the chat and she will answer them at the end of her presentation. If you experience any technical difficulties during the program, kindly type a private chat to my wonderful JCC colleague who is wearing a mask. She's waving her hand, Deanna DiLello, and she will do her very best to help you. To open our program, Vivian Felsen, representative of the Committee for Yiddish, will now say a few words.
Thank you, Lisa. Shalom Aleichem, a guten Tag. Ich heiße Vivian Felsen und es ist mein großes Vergnügen, euch zu begrüßen im Namen von dem Komitee für Yiddish bei der Toronto Yiddische Föderation. My name is Vivian Felsen and it is my great pleasure to bring you greetings on behalf of the UJA Committee for Yiddish. Over the years, our Committee for Yiddish has collaborated with Lisa Roy and Adult Daytime at Miles Nadal JCC to provide Yiddish-related programming, often for this Thursday group. And it's great for me to be back with you today. It was to this group that I gave my first Zoom lecture almost 2 years ago. Today is March 17th, as we've heard. And my mother, Anne Medras Glass, was also born on this day in 1919. In the 1970s, she was instrumental in instituting and organizing the Yiddish language and literature program at the University of Toronto. She was also one of its first instructors. It is therefore especially meaningful for me that our guest speaker today is my talented young friend, Miriam Borden. My mother would have been amazed and delighted to know that in 2022, young scholars like Miriam are doing their PhDs in Yiddish studies and right here in Toronto. On behalf of our committee, I would like to wish you a happy Purim, an enjoyable afternoon, a freilichen Purim.
A herzlichen Dank. Wonderful. Thank you so much, Vivian. And now it gives me great pleasure to introduce today's guest speaker, a Toronto-based doctoral student in Yiddish studies. Miriam Borden is an educator, collector, and translator who is actively involved in preserving and publicizing the Yiddish history of Toronto. In addition to teaching Yiddish language and culture classes at University of Toronto, Miriam works closely with the Ontario Jewish Archives on a number of Yiddish initiatives, including leading walking tours of Kensington Market, translating Yiddish materials from the collection, and creating social media posts featuring a hashtag Yiddish Word of the Week. Miriam has been a fellow in the oral history and Yiddish pedagogy programs at the Yiddish Book Center in Amherst, Massachusetts, and she is working on a dissertation about the great Canadian Yiddish folk song collector, Ruth Rubin. Please join me in a very warm JCC welcome for Miriam Borden.
Thank you so much. Lisa, thank you so much. Vivian, thank you. Deanna, our wonderful tech support. an administrative goddess. It's a pleasure to be with you all today. I'm going to take off my mustache, sadly, but there we are. Hello, everybody. Freilichen Purim. Happy Purim. Chag Sameach. It is a delight to be with you today on Purim Day, on St. Patrick's Day, celebrating in whatever ways we celebrate, eating our hamantashen, drinking our wine, learning about the Purim Shpiel. I'm going to share my screen with you now. I have a really fun presentation for us all today, and I hope you enjoy. Okay, hopefully you can see my screen. And here we go. Today I'm going to be talking about the Purim Shpiel throughout history. Let's just dive right in. I want to begin with some really evocative text from Nechama Sandro's book called Vagabond Stars. It still is one of these sort of landmark books on the Yiddish theater. It's from the 1970s, and yet it's still one of the best, I think. It's one of the best ways to learn about the history of the Purim Shpiel. So here we go. Nechama writes, leading off the festive parade come the clowns, all sorts of clowns. First the Marshalek, the grand marshal of the revels, riding a horse through the Prague ghetto, wearing the elaborate Baroque gentleman's costume of his day, the 1740s, and showing the way with his staff. So here is the first leading off the way, the parade that introduces the Purim Shpiel, the Purim play. Bear with me just a moment, technical difficulties. Here we are. Following him is a nar, or fool, a red veil like a woman's over his head, a spangly blue mantle covering him and his horse together. The mantle is hung with pastries. As he rides, he nibbles away at his costume and imitates bugle noises without a horn. Next comes the clown hero of the day and of the parade and of the play that is to follow. He rides enthroned on a wine cask pulled along by a crowd of schoolboys, students at the local yeshiva. He is the crazy Purim king, a Bacchus, fat as a frog, waving an enormous wine glass and smiling, smiling, smiling. Then come more clowns, each one a master of his own absurdity. One hung with kitchen utensils, wearing an upside-down pot for a hat and jigging up and down. Another dressed as a servant girl who leads an old nar behind her by a string. A clown who keeps rushing out among the crowd of spectators to kiss the old ladies. A harlequin in the green costume associated with the figure called Pickle Herring. A clown doing tricks on the back of a wooden horse. The half-fool who is dressed like a harlequin on one side and a sensible man on the other. He may be the one to speak the prologue when the play starts. Musicians in all sorts of costumes. One group dressed like Turks with turbans and beards, crowds of masqueraders dancing through the ghetto streets, and all the procession winding toward the Purim play, the Purim Shpiel. So, what is a Purim Shpiel? This grand play that this parade introduces. As we may know, the ritual commandments of Purim are to hear the reading of the Megillah, the reading of the scroll of Esther, to give mishloach manot, right, gifts of food and drink, and to hold a lavish festive meal, a Purim Seudah, that extends long into the night with masquerades, plays, amusements, and a hefty amount of wine. These are the commandments for celebrating the holiday of Purim. A Purim Shpiel, or Purim play, combines the elements of inversion and reversal that are intrinsically rooted in the holiday, rooted in the story of the scroll of Esther, with elements of carnival, the European, carnival festivals. Purim Shpielen were historically short comic plays in Yiddish, composed by artisans and yeshiva students, based on parodies of Hebrew texts from the Bible, the Talmud, Midrashic literature, and liturgy. The earliest Purim Shpiel we have today, the one that survives, dates to 1697, but the Purim Shpiel is probably at least 100 years older than that. These plays incorporated the aesthetics of the grotesque and created conflict-laden situations, which brought out the subversive perspectives of the audience and the cast on contemporary matters. So thereby extending the messages of the Megillah to the lives of the Jews in Europe, making the Megillah relevant in new ways and interpreting it anew every single year. The performers of the Purim Shpielen were historically not professional actors. They came from the lower levels of society. They were tailors, cobblers, woodworkers, and so on. And they performed their Shpielen during the Purim Seuda, during the holiday meal, in the living rooms of the balabatim, the householders, the well-off in the community, who would pay the performers either with money, with food, sometimes a combination of the two. The structure and the style of the Purim Shpiel resembles farce. It inverts power structures and stages the grotesque using stereotypical characters, simple plots, vulgarities, obscenities, blasphemies. It's a lot of fun. It's a mix of high and low registers of speech. And in general, the Purim Shpiel transgressed social norms and showed versions of the world that were upside down in order to sort of fulfill the words of the Megillah, of the scroll, v'nahafochu, and it was inverted and it was reversed. Jewish theater, I'm going to take a minute just to talk about Jewish theater because it did develop slightly differently, in a different way from that of other cultures for a number of reasons. Number one, the rabbis of the Mishnah and the Talmud living in the Hellenistic period had a keen awareness of the theater from Roman culture, which was all around them. And of course, that's a pagan culture. The rabbis of the Talmud expressly forbid Jews from attending the theater for three reasons. And these are: the first, the rabbis viewed the theater as a gateway to a range of idolatrous behavior, because as we know, the Roman stage might have included animal sacrifice, gladiator battles, and actors dressed as gods. So number one, that's a no-no. Number two, the rabbis considered productions like this to be bittul Torah, or sort of a waste of precious time that could have been used learning Torah instead. So that's number two. Number three, the Roman theater involved violence, like gladiator shows and so on. And the Talmud explicitly says that anybody who witnesses such violence and does nothing about it is essentially complicit in it. And so a third reason why Jews would be forbidden from attending the Roman theater in ancient times. But what's interesting is that despite these warnings of the rabbis, the level of detail the rabbis used to describe everything that might be happening at the Roman theater suggests that Jews were attending theater. Rabbis seem to know quite a bit about what's happening at the Roman theater. And so they seem to know where a theatrical performance might take place. They seem to know when, they seem to know who might be in attendance. And so it seems as though they have a very good handle on the Roman theater. And so, you know, regardless, it looks like Jews were probably attending the theater and developing a sense of theatricality, their own. But the celebration of Purim, even in the ancient world, you know, despite the warnings of the rabbi, did lend itself to displays, public displays, and performative festivities. Early sources for carousing on Purim come from the Talmud. This is from the Babylonian Talmud. Amar Rava Mechayev Inish Levasomei Bepuraya Adelo Yada Ben Arur Haman Levaruch Mordechai. Rava said, a man is obligated to mellow oneself or to become drunk until he does not know the difference between the cursed Haman and blessed Mordechai, the two, the villain of the scroll and the hero of the scroll. Another source, and this is a bit longer, I'll just read this one in English because my Aramaic is not as good as it once was. The Gemara relates that Rabbah and Rabbi Zerah prepared a Purim feast with each other, and they became intoxicated to the point that Rabbah arose and slaughtered Rabbi Zerah. The next day, when he became sober and realized what he had done, Rabbah asked God for mercy, and God revived him. The next year, Rabbah said to Rabbi Zerah, "Let the master come and let us prepare the Purim feast with each other." He said to him, "Miracles do not happen each and every hour, and I do not want to undergo that experience again." In other words, why don't we play it safe and not have a Purim feast because we don't want to repeat the events of last year. So Purim seemed to get out of hand very quickly, even in the ancient world. In addition, in the time of the sage known as Rava, who's different from Rabbah, I should say. So these are different sages. And anyway, it's the 3rd or the 4th century. It was customary to light a bonfire on Purim inside a pit, and children would amuse themselves by leaping over the bonfire. So what I'm trying to show you here is that celebrations of Purim were not limited to, eating Purim, the Purim feast and reading the Megillah. There were performative aspects, certainly, that are part of Purim that predate the Purim Shpiel by 1,000 years, let's say. And part of that might be because of the very theatrical, dramatic sort of nature of the scroll itself, of the story of the scroll. And going back to this idea of these bonfires, in fact, fire and the burning of Haman was a feature of performative Purim celebrations from ancient times all the way through the Middle Ages. These were far more angry, violent, and vengeful displays than the Purim Shpiel turned out to be. As early as the 5th century and into the 9th and 10th centuries, it was a custom to burn an effigy of Haman on a cross. The Roman Church actually banned this practice in the year 408, which they viewed it as a mockery of the crucifixion of Jesus. The fact that the church had to ban it, again, indicates that this was a fairly widespread practice. In Italy, Jewish children would line up in rows and pelt each other with nuts as part of Purim festivities, while the adults rode through the streets with fir tree branches in their hands, shouting and blowing trumpets around a doll representing Haman, who was then burned at the stake with these fir tree branches. So yeah, a lot more violent, a lot more vengeful, very different from Purim festivities as we know them today. The Purim Shpiel as we know it, and this is an illustration of a Purim Shpiel that would have been familiar to people living in judging by the dress, probably the mid, let's say, 18th century. The Purim Shpiel as we know it emerged around the time of the Renaissance, probably as a Jewish equivalent of the Fastnacht Spiel, the German plays that were performed during Shrovetide that emerged in the 15th century. But the Purim Shpiel was also distinctive and culturally specific to Ashkenazi Jewish society. It wasn't simply an imitation. It had its own character. What is a Purim Shpiel? Again, the Purim Shpiel can be considered a theatrical genre that is a fusion of various elements from different eras. It emerged and evolved from these public improvisations and reenactments of the hanging of Haman that I described a minute ago, as well as from medieval parodies of drashot, which are teachings, and burlesque sketches on daily life in Jewish communities. One of the first appearances of the term Purim Shpiel dates to 1555 in Italy in a poem by an educator from Poland called Gumprecht of Szczebrzeszyn, a poem that he wrote inspired by the Book of Esther. That's 1555 is the first time we hear the word Purim Shpiel. Over time, the tradition of the Purim Shpiel developed in two directions. First, there are comic plays based on the Book of Esther, where strong moral messages for the audience would be interwoven with burlesque, scenes full of obscenities, insults, and other types of transgressive behavior. This was in the style of the carnival tradition and probably grew out of that German Fastnachtspiel. We will come back to this style of play in just a minute. That's the kind of play I want to talk about in more depth. The other kind of Purim Shpiel that emerged was a biblical drama. Often it was the story of the sale of Joseph by his brothers, in which case it would be called a Yosef Shpiel. This kind of Purim play came later, around the turn of the 18th century, when many features of popular Jewish theatrical performance were being suppressed from two sides. The rabbis, on the one hand, who condemned the obscenities of Purim plays, and the church because of the play's anti-Christian undertones. So the biblical theater based on biblical stories, was considered a more serious genre. that would less likely to sort of descend into that kind of lewd behavior and obscenity that the authorities were so concerned about. There was no obscenity here. There was nothing really comic. The subject matter included plays about the sale of Joseph by his brothers, Moses and Pharaoh, the binding of Isaac, Hannah and Peninnah, the story of Jonah, Solomon and the demon Ashmodai, and others. So essentially, the entire biblical canon was open for was available for a Purim Shpiel. And I want to play you a song. Let's see if I can. Whoops. Bear with me. I want to play you a song. Or sorry, I want to show you a song, not play you a song. From one of these biblical plays. This is sung by Lifshe Schechter Wiedmann in 1954. And you have the Yiddish on the screen. I'll read through the Yiddish and the English. Bitte fürs Weib hat mich angerät, ich soll mit ihr schlufen. Cho mich getina bor mit den Yetzer Hora, as Gott wird mich strufen. Potiphar's wife tried to convince me that I should sleep with her. I struggled with the evil inclination and remembered God would punish me. Potiphar's Weib hat mich angerät, mir sollen schlufen beide. Cho mich getina bor mit den Yetzer Hora, as Yitzchak is mein Seide. Potiphar's wife tried to convince me that we should sleep together. I struggled with the evil inclination and remembered Isaac was my grandfather. Potiphar's Weib hat mich angerät, mir sollen sein zusammen. Cho mich getina bor mit den Yetzer Hora, as Ruchel is mein Mame. Potiphar's wife tried to convince me we should be together. I struggled with the evil inclination and remembered Rachel was my mother. So this was sung. This was a song, and as you can see, there's repetition in the Yiddish. You hear the rhyme, I hope. A part of this repetition and the rhyme was to help actors remember these songs, because in general, Purim Shpielen were not written down. So this is all part of the character of the Purim Shpiel. It's kind of spontaneous. A lot of it is done by memory, with spontaneous elements, and often biblical material was perfectly suited to kind of to stirring the emotions of the audiences watching and listening. Okay. The Purim Shpiel certainly is a far cry from a burning effigy of Haman, but early Shpielen were definitely not devoid of violence. The onstage role of Haman, the villain of the play, was the target of verbal and even physical abuse. And in the early 18th century in Poland and Ukraine, it was not uncommon for Jewish communities to hire a Christian to play Haman. I think you understand the intention there. In 1722, the Bishop of Lutsk actually forbade Catholics from taking part in Purim Shpiels for this very reason. But even at the end of the 19th century, it was common for the role of Haman to be played by a young Christian, preferably one who spoke Yiddish. And there was, as we know, a lot of crossover, of course. In the 16th through the 18th centuries, the figure of Haman also took on a Christian appearance on stage. So, for example, an ecclesiastical cross would be worn prominently on the garments of the character. Later, for example, in the Lithuanian shtetl in the 19th century, Haman wore the cast-off uniform of the local district commissioner. And in this way, the Jewish community released their pent-up rage with the Hamans of their daily lives, those who oppress them in their daily lives, those who they feel repressed and oppressed by. Avraham Simcha Sachs, who lived from 1879 to 1931, he was a journalist for the Yiddish press. He wrote in his memoir, and this is a quote, "Each and every one of us would take it out on Haman, one with a good dig, another with a wallop. This one would pinch him, another one would spit at him. Everybody considered it a mitzvah to inflict all kinds of torture on Haman." From the perspective of anthropology, the Purim Shpiel tradition is similar to a rite of passage connected with the change of seasons and the carnival-like transgressions that accompany it, right? Considering that Purim always happens around the springtime, that change in the seasons in the folk life of many cultures around Europe was sort of a time of unpredictability and capriciousness. The Purim Shpiel evolved under the influence of medieval Europe, of the carnival festivals of medieval Europe, right? Which of course occur at the same time as Purim. And like non-Jewish folk theater, the Purim Shpiel took a well-known myth or story and translated it into a parody with elements that the audience could recognize in their own lives. But the Purim Shpiel's corollary isn't a folktale or a morality play, it's text, and that's what makes it sort of unique. The corollary to the Purim Shpiel is the text of the Megillah, the scroll of Esther, is a text from the ancient world, and the Purim Shpiel and the Shpielers, the actors, relied on the audience's familiarity with that text. Now, why could they rely on that familiarity? Well, because the essence of the festival, as we said, is the reading of the Megillah. So there's this idea that in Jewish society, everybody would have gone to hear the reading of the Megillah. Everybody would be at least a little bit familiar with the story, with the text. And not just that text, but also the Agada, the additional commentaries and additional stories from the sages, from the ancient world that are tacked onto the Megillah to give it more color and more drama. They're familiar with those. They're familiar with the Targum, the translation of the Megillah. They're familiar with a whole host of texts, not just the Hebrew text of the scroll. And this is important because of the relatively high rates of literacy among Jews, at least male Jews, in the Middle Ages and into the Renaissance period. Jewish communities had unusually high rates of literacy. In synagogue, Jews would hear the drama of the Megillah unfold in a solemn, very formal setting in the sacred language of Hebrew. But the Purim Shpiel, in the spirit of Purim, would be a total inversion of that reading. Whereas the Megillah text is fixed and unchanging, a central feature of many of the Purim Shpielen were improvisation. Like in this example, where I'm going to show you now, the slide where the stage directions read, Kommt Mordechai und sagt, was sagt. Mordechai enters and says whatever he says. In other words, giving the actor playing Mordechai complete license to insert whatever he wants in that moment. In addition, there's another place, entfert Mordechai, was entfert. He answers whatever he answers. And again, giving him total license to be creative with the role of Mordechai. More inversion can be seen in biblical plays where even though there is less obscenity and kind of lewd, I guess, performance on stage, there's still inversion, there's still parody. And here, for example, is Jacob's blessing to his sons from the Bible. This is sort of complicated. This relies on on Chumash Taich being the Yiddish translation of the Bible, which you would do word by word. So it would be Vayomer, which means in Hebrew, and he said, and so Vayomer und hat gesagt. You would read the Hebrew word from the Bible. Immediately following would be the Yiddish translation, and you would do this word by word by word. And this excerpt from a Purim play from around 1904 is playing with that form of reading Torah, right, in that bilingual. So Hamalach der Gesaltener, Hagoyel der Impgezipte, Oisi mir Amakedir. So it sort of plays with the text. The angel salted. It's essentially making up plays with the text, making up farcical translations, right? That's the idea. The angel who salted, which redeemed, dirty, me, for me a blow, to you from all of the stick, evil a star. It's a little bit complicated to explain in English. It really relies on Hebrew and Yiddish, but I think you get the idea. In other words, biblical Purim Shpielen were also full of this really playful language that almost always, whether it's a biblical play, whether it's a play based on the scroll, always relied on playing with language, playing with different registers of language, a bilingual play, which to these multilingual audiences would have made a lot of sense and would have been quite comical, actually. I should also note that many of the Purim Shpielen that I'm going to show you today, and many of the Purim Shpielen we've already looked at, only exist. We only have them today because ethnographers chose to save them. And this one, for example, comes from somebody called Weissenberg. Weissenberg was a Jewish ethnographer and anthropologist from Yelisvetgrad or Kherson in Russia. He compiled a sort of verbal traditional Purim Shpiel of his hometown to save it from being lost. So in other words, many of these people understood that times were changing, especially the turn of the 20th century. Much of the folk culture of their shtetl, of their towns, would be lost. And so they sat down and recorded what they could. So we owe them quite a lot. So essentially, Purim Shpielen were theatrical and parodic reenactments of the stories Jews heard read out loud every week in synagogue, whether it was the Bible stories or whether it was the story of the scroll. And in that way, the dramatization in the form of the Purim Shpiel was sort of a natural outgrowth. What's even more, these were stories that carried sort of meta-historical significance for Jews. I think this is something that we can identify with today, even. These are origin legends that took audiences back 2,000 or even more years. But in the case of the story of the Book of Esther, or the much performed story of Joseph and his brothers, these are also stories where themes of suffering, persecution, and awaiting redemption resonated with audiences and paralleled their experiences as Jews living in the diaspora, waiting desperately for the exile to come to an end, for whether that's realizing national aspirations of autonomy, or whether that's waiting for Mashiach, the days of the Messiah. The Purim Shpiel embodies this very complex interplay between respect on the one hand and transgression on the other. And I think that's really clear, especially in something like this, what we're looking at now, the blessing of Jacob to his sons. There's respect for religious themes like those found in the Bible and the Book of Esther, and there are transgressions that are front and center in parody, in laughter, social criticism, and the carnival-like inversion that Purim plays often centered around. And that's what the Purim Shpiel is all about. It's all about subversion and inversion. The pious are lewd and lowly, and the powerful are foolish and useless. And I want to give you an example of that. So here's from a spiel in Mogilov, Russia, that was performed until the beginning of the 20th century, where the hero of Purim, Mordechai, is reduced to a laughingstock. Here you go. Fusyid Monderche, a Schlepper, a Bettler, wo a Chassene, wo a Briss, dorten hat gar nicht gefällt und a Teller gestellt. A Porträt, auf ihm zu gucken, a Harbe auf den Rücken und drer tut gucken. Noch a Simen will ich euch sagen, man hat nicht lang im Bankes gestellt zum Rücken. Again, full of rhyme, full of rhythm. All the better to remember these plays orally. Wandering Jew, Monderche, so they even get his name wrong. He's not Mordechai, he's Monderche. A pauper, a beggar at every wedding, every circumcision where nothing is missing and everything is laid on the plate. What a portrait to look at. Hunchback, staring at the ground. And I'll tell you another sign. Recently, his back was treated with cupping. So the hero, Mordechai, is really reduced to somebody to poke fun at, to laugh at. Here's another one. This is now making the heroine of the story, Queen Esther, into a laughingstock. This also from 1904. Herrje kindrig, ich hab von deinet wegen a maid. Is sie a so groß wie a berische Weide. A Zung mit a paar Lippen, hotsch in der Erd a reinstippen. Ha klal sie is schein mit ausgefurzte Zehen. Hat mir mit a Stern, mir kon dem ganzen Mark auskehren. Mit a bleichen Harz mit a kupernem Beuch und a Pipik wie a Makrete. Look here, little king, I found you a girl, tiny as a bear's tail. She has a tongue and a pair of lips, and all you have to do is push her to the ground. In short, she's pretty, with holes in her teeth, a brow and thick hair, good to sweep the market with. Her heart is made of tin, a copper belly, and a navel like a rinsing bowl. So again, you see, poking absolute fun at the idea of a beautiful Queen Esther who was literally fit for a king, right? in the way the scroll has it. In the Purim Shpiel, she's reduced to something much more lewd, much more lowly. So these plays, and I think you're getting a taste of this now, and we'll see some more examples. These plays tended to play upon the most extreme and distinctive elements of Jewish culture. The sacred on the one hand and the transgressive on the other. The high culture of Hebrew and the popular culture of Yiddish, the pure on the one hand, the impure on the other. The vernacular language of Yiddish became a space for very creative takes on language, on social criticism, on a questioning of the dominant values of society around them. If the Megillah told you in Hebrew how things were and must be, the Purim Shpiel in Yiddish opened and exploited the possibilities of what could and should be. So there's so play and questioning authority and poking fun, for example, like here at heroes and heroines, is very much part of the Purim Shpiel spirit. And with that in mind, I think we should also remember that there are social and political dimensions to the Purim Shpiel. Like all theatrical performance, Purim Shpiels offer an outlet for passions, for conflicts, for social conflicts, social frustrations. And in Purim Shpiels, this often appeared as diatribes against the learned and against the rich, or against rabbis and community leaders, a kind of ironic reversal of the abuse directed to Haman during the Megillah reading, right? It's a time for social critique and for satire, a time for overturning the scales of power, and for people who were largely powerless. The Purim play was one place where they could enact their secret wishes and ambitions, and maybe not so secret, right? And in this image, again, the performers enter the house of the well-to-do to entertain them, and make fun of them, poke fun at them, in a, I guess, a way that would not be too offensive because they're still relying on them for their paycheck. They're still relying on them to share their food. But in a way that, little jabs here and there against the powerful, the wealthy, the rich, everything that the Purim Shpielers were not. So again, who were the Purim Shpielers? They could be professional entertainers like the Badchen, for example. Here's a Badchen dancing at a Hasidic wedding, a postcard illustrated in 1902. The Badchen is the figure in the middle doing a dance. They could be townspeople who filled the roles of Mordechai, Esther, Haman, and whoever once a year at Purim. They could be normal workaday people who came out in their theatrical personas once a year. All the roles were played by men and boys, traditionally. This was the only day of the year when cross-dressing was allowed, although we do know of a few women who were acrobats and dancers, so it's not unheard of. But overall, I think it's important to remember that the actors of the Purim Shpiel were often from the lower stratum of society. They were tailors, they were cobblers, they were chimney sweeps. They used the Purim play to take aim at the upper classes. And in the tradition of carnival, they did so using curses, obscenities, grotesqueries, almost all of which focused on the human body, especially the lower parts. So Purim plays are full of, I think, material that might surprise us today, given, we're talking about plays from the 1700s, the 1800s, but that was very much a part of the culture as well, as it is today. Grotesque aesthetics, if we think about classical art, the grotesque is sort of the opposite of the classical. These are in direct contrast to classical aesthetics, where the body is perfect, it's in harmony with nature. In the grotesque, the bodily functions are emphasized, and breasts, phallus, testicles are often physically exaggerated in dialogue, costume, or performance styles. And here's an example from a Purim Shpiel from 1708. Lashana toive stinkendige Beitzim, den Melech sollen geschwellen seine Beitzim. Happy New Year, stinking eggs. May the king's balls grow and swell. This was a line delivered during a Purim Shpiel in 1708. As you might expect, things like this were not always looked kindly upon by scholars of Jewish history who were trying to sort of liberate, I guess, Jewish culture, the way they saw it, liberate Jewish culture from being this sort of lowly culture and really bring it into the great sort of pantheon of European cultures. The Jewish literature critic Elazar Shulman did not approve of the Purim Shpiel. He wrote, "The gory show, now known as the Achashverosh Shpiel, was obviously conceived by some nameless devil whose bloodthirsty language evokes horror and pain. These are words from a foul mouth, which the pauper can barely tolerate. The creator was a Polish vagabond living in Germany, the scum of the earth, the subject of incessant complaints." They did not look kindly upon the Purim Shpiel, and especially the more grotesque elements of the Purim Shpiel. And this, of course, he's writing already in the 19th century. So the 19th century perspective on the Purim Shpiel might have differed considerably from the 18th or 17th century perspective. And this opinion reflected the view of both the Orthodox and the Maskilim, the proponents of the Enlightenment, the Haskalah, the Jewish Enlightenment, which really was arguing that Jewish culture had as much to offer the world as any of the other European cultures. Jewish culture had literature, Jewish culture had art, Jewish culture had theater, and should be considered, shouldn't be cast to one side, should be considered, worthy of consideration, of praise, of performance. We should perform plays. We should not be ashamed of our Jewish culture. Of course, that's a little bit difficult to argue if the subject matter is somewhat, it's grotesque, right? By the late 18th century, Maskilim, these proponents of the Haskalah, began to denounce the Purim Shpiel entirely. This has to do, with the unrestrained revelry. They found this just to be poor taste in general. They rejected it as what they called a form of ghetto culture, and they found it unsophisticated and representative of a culture that they were trying to rise above and leave behind. But in Eastern Europe, the tradition of the Purim Shpiel continued. Just because they sort of castigated the Purim Shpiel did not prevent people from enjoying it, from performing it year after year, especially Purim being this very festive holiday where this commandment to drink until you don't know the difference between Mordechai and Haman wasn't exactly you can't exactly expect people to stay in line, especially not with a tradition hundreds of years old, right? The Purim plays that continue to be performed in Eastern Europe drew primarily on themes from traditional Jewish texts, as I said earlier, including Midrash, Agadah, also elements of popular Jewish culture that were funneled through yeshivas. So these could be parodies of rabbis or comical sermons, things like that, or by carnivalesque figures like the clown, the leitz, the fool, the nar, the jester, the badchen. Other figures in the Purim Shpiel would have included a master of ceremonies who was called the payatz or the marshelik, who would be charged with blessing the public, or blessing the homeowners in whose home the play is taking place. He would start the action, summarize the action, comment upon it, introduce the actors, including figures like the messenger called the loifer, the scribe, the writer, the schreiber. Many of these roles also were interchangeable. So not every play included each one of these roles, but and I suppose you could have one actor playing multiple roles at once as well, given, depending on who was available in the town, what kind of talent was available in the town. Now I want to share with you a really wonderful, soundbite from somebody who grew up, Fegal Sultan, was recorded in 1948 by the folk song collector Ruth Rubin. She's describing the Purim Shpiel in her town. And I'll read the English and then we'll listen to it. "Let me tell you how they used to put on a Purim Shpiel in our town. All the workers, tailors, shoemakers, and others, even a chimney sweep, I recall, who was black with soot and filthy all year long. But on Purim, he would wash himself so you could barely recognize him. And suddenly we'd see that he was a good-looking guy with a handsome face and laughing eyes. And he'd wear a sword with a belt, with a crown, and he would be King Achashverosh. And we children would run after him. And when they would all gather in a Jewish house, they'd sing.
Da will ich erzählen, was wir sieben bei unseren Städtelflecken spielen, Purim Shpiel. Die alle Arbeiter, überhaupt gedenken, Cheminkerer, was das ganze Jahr gewesen, ein schwarzer, eingerichteter Schase. Doch Purim fleckt sich mit dem Mal einwaschen, wir flecken kennen, man kann man nicht erkennen. Und er wusste, dass er hat einen schönen Pony mit Lachen dagegen. Und er fleckt dann ein Schwert mit der Passek, mit der Krähen, und fleckt sein Prinz auch ein Schweres. Und wir Kinder flecken noch immer noch lebt. Und als sie flecken rein in ein jüdisches Haus, flecken sie das Singen nach.
Okay. And here we go.
Good Purim, meine liebe Jiden, Huletun, sei weit zufrieden. Wir haben ein Gott, was nimmt sich Fahr und Sohn, Fahr und Sieden, wie weiter konnte. Bim bam bam, biba bam bam, biba bam, bim bam bam, biba bam bam.
It's remarkable, really, that she remembered all of this. She remembered all the words. She goes on. Then an old Jew would enter with a long beard, wide as this. He was a shoemaker, and he would always sit all curled up. We never saw him except on Purim, when he would spread his great shoulders and don a beard, and would enter with a long cane and sing the following.
Noch gekommen ein Auto mit der Größe Brot, mit der breiter Saar. Gewähne sie allemal ein Schusterfig sitzen eingewickelt, mit dem gar keiner gesehen. Noch vielleicht Purim vielleicht ausbreiten, seine breite Plätze, sonst ein Abwort, und vielleicht reingehen mit der Größen stecken und singen. Hier bin der alter Mann, Jankiv, mit meinen 12 singen. Hab getan die Welt streiten, aher und ahin. Lohner Armee sind gegen mir gekommen. Und Gott hat getan an es, und wir haben beigekommen.
And she goes on, in fact, to describe that, and we have a recording of this. I won't play it, but she goes on to describe that in the town, there were also Polish parts to these songs and Russian parts of these songs, because Polish noblemen living in the town and Russian noblemen living in the town would also be kind of involved in this Purim Shpiel. They would approach them, perform for them, and essentially ask for money, asking for money for Maos Chitin, which is money for the poor to purchase matzah for Passover. They would ask them for money to pay for Bikur Cholim, visiting the sick. And they would do this in Polish, they would do it in Russian, so that they would sort of become partners in the Purim Shpiel. So lest we think this was only something limited to the Jewish community, I think that was probably true in some cases, but in some cases, especially in places where there's a very mixed population, you had everybody understood Russian, everybody understood Polish, the Jews understood Yiddish, and everybody sort of became part of the Purim Shpiel together in this way, which I think is also quite fascinating. A couple of things I just want to say about Fagel Sultan's remembrance of the Purim Shpiel in her town. You sort of have the transformation of these blue collar workaday figures in her town, the tailor, the cobbler, the chimney sweep, and they transform in the Purim Shpiel into a king, a prince. It's an absolutely transformational kind of performance. And she describes the way that they would actually change the way they carried themselves. The shoulders that were, hunched over, working at the work table all year, would suddenly open up, and the chimney sweep, whose face was covered in soot, all of a sudden you didn't recognize him. So there really was sort of at least in her memories as a child, a real transformation, a magical sort of transformation of the Purim Shpielers for the Purim Shpiel. And there's this beautiful way that the children really looked up to the Purim Shpielers, following them in the street from house to house and running after them. And the fact that she remembers these songs, like I say, is remarkable. Again, and just the fact that this is a town-wide event that engages and involves so many different kinds of people in the town. Not only the children who run after the Purim Shpielers, not only the Purim Shpielers themselves who transform into these characters, but also normal townspeople, Polish nobility, and so on. real window for me, this particular recording, into that entire world. As features of, despite, I should say, despite the magic that I at least find in this kind of remembrance of the Purim Shpiel, these are features of low culture, what's called low culture. They're popular culture that authorities attempted to stifle when they could. And because of that, relatively few copies of printed Purim Shpiels have survived. But one of the benefits of a folk tradition like the Purim Shpiel is that despite the strong ties of the text to the text of the Megillah, this was largely passed around in oral form, right? Through songs like this, through rhyming schemes, through poems. And the evidence is right here in these rhythmic rhyming songs, in the music, which was so rarely written down that we only have a few instances of, we only really know what many of these songs sounded like because of either ethnographers transcribed the music, so there are only a couple of those, or people like Fagel Sultan were recorded singing these songs before they forgot them or passed away. So it's quite rare actually to actually hear a Purim Shpiel song from the early 20th century, late 19th century. I want to share with you another description of a Purim Shpiel in somewhere around Lodz, Poland, around the turn of the century. This comes from the memories of Michael Gelbart, who was a very famous composer and a music critic, born in 1889. He was one of 17 children in a very poor family, and began his career as a musical protege at the age of 5 when he first served as a cantor's assistant in the synagogue. He was amazing, Michael Gelbart. He died in 1966. And he explains that for him, the performers in his town were meshoyerim, which are cantor's assistants, klezmoirim, which are instrumentalists, klezmer musicians, and badchonim, jesters, wedding jesters. And because they tended to spend a lot of time together, they tended to sort of create their own little subculture of musician performers. And these were the ones they would put on the Purim Shpiel every year. And here we go. He says, the first stop was Shloime Ochsenhändler, the richest man in town. We threw open the doors. First, the 2 clowns, masters of ceremony, entered and yelled out, "Make way, the Purim Shpielers are here." And then all the Shpielers flooded in with joyous singing. He says, in each wealthy household where we presented the Purim Shpiel, the festive, happy audience rewarded the Purim Shpielers generously. Handfuls of money without measure. They added to that other good things from the Purim feast, Hamantaschen and strudel, oranges and nuts and boiled chickpeas, so that when we were done with all the performances, Berel Orchik and Yachtzel Koval, the 2 strongest boys in town, could hardly carry the big basket full of all the loot. Which, of course, what he's alluding to is after the Purim Shpielers finished their rounds performing in town, they would feast. They would have their own Purim Seuda. They would have their own Purim feast and feast on everything they'd collected from their audiences. One more genre of the Purim Shpiel that I want to talk about, a genre that would be intertwined with the themes of the Megillah or of the biblical stories, was the smuggler play or the robber play, known as the Gazlan Shpiel or the Räuberband Shpiel. These were plays about lawbreakers, particularly bands of highwaymen and robbers. They were plays where the plot revolved around the interaction between a lawbreaker and the authorities, whether this was an innocent victim who aligns with the law in an attempt to thwart the lawbreaker, usually unsuccessfully, or whether this is a lawbreaker and an innocent figure, let's say a landlord or somebody in cahoots trying to form an alliance against the authorities, right? That's normally the kind of plot. These were tremendously popular in 19th century Shtetlach. And we can ask why. Well, as a whole, the genre of the smuggler play and other plays about highwaymen and brigands, these plays convey a sense that justice lies outside the power of the official system. That the official system is somehow bad at keeping lawbreakers at bay, at making sure that justice is served. They suggest that law enforcement is ineffectual, that breaking the law in maybe violent and non-violent ways, like smuggling, like bribery, may actually be necessary for survival in this kind of a world where law enforcement is ineffectual. You need to swindle and lie and cheat and smuggle in order to survive. That's what these plays sort of suggest. I guess thinking about them, what they represent in this 19th century world. And of course, these are themes that appear in the Purim story too, right? Injustice, immoral authorities, concealing one's identity in order to achieve justice, things like that. So these are themes that have resonance with the story of Purim as well. I want to show you just a very, very brief little translation of a play called Contraband. Somewhere around the First World War, this was likely performed. Again, this was transcribed by ethnographers who realized how important it would be to record these plays with pen and paper before they were lost from all memory. And I guess I've been wondering how to convey this. This is a play that really relies on bilingualism. It really relies on knowing Russian and knowing Yiddish as well. So, for example, there's a Jew who's hiding. He's hiding. He doesn't want to be found. And they find him hiding in a cupboard. The police commissioner says, "Turn over the passport." And the Jew who doesn't really understand Russian, that's the joke here. He's not very good in Russian. He says, "Are you going to give me a smack?" Which is a patch in Yiddish. It sounds sort of like passport, right? And the policeman takes the sack of goods off him and gives it to the police commissioner for inspection. And he says to the Jew, "Do you have a certificate?" Which my Russian is terrible, but świadectwo for these goods. And the Jew says, "What do you want from me? A pair of soles?" Which in Yiddish is podeshvelech, sorry, in Yiddish. "I just resold my shoes. You want to tear the soles off?" So it's the whole comedy. It's about not understanding each other, the authorities being almost ridiculously kind of officious, and the Jews being sort of hapless and just trying to survive in this world where they're trying to make a living, they're trying to get by, and the authorities in their officiousness and their sort of zeal for the law, which doesn't make sense, sort of have no sympathy whatsoever for the position of Jews, and it's always a situation of misunderstanding, and a Jew always getting in trouble because not understanding either the law or the law enforcement officials, and this is an example of that. In modernity, when we reach sort of the 20th century, the Purim Shpiel in this traditional form that we've been talking about becomes displaced. It doesn't disappear, but it becomes sort of displaced by the advent of the modern Yiddish theater. Really beginning in the 1880s with the beginnings of the modern Yiddish theater as we know it, of musicals and operettas and things like that. This really starts in the 1880s and it goes into the early 20th century, the rise of the modern Yiddish theater, which is a very sophisticated form of modernist art. I hope you can just tell from the image I'm showing you here, this poster for a play called Wir Frauen, We Women, which is a radical feminist work. And it's highly sophisticated, modernist to cutting edge modernism, put it that way. Modernism to lead all other modernist forms of art. That's what the Yiddish theater really was. And the Yiddish theater is born out of radical changes to the ways of Jewish life in Eastern and Central Europe that begin with sort of the urbanization, centralization of government, industrialization in the 1880s and 90s, violence following the assassination of the Tsar in the 1880s that make Jews really rethink where they're living and how they're living, spur them to move to the cities, maybe emigrate altogether out of Europe. And art is born out of all kinds of situations, especially difficult ones. The Yiddish theater comes out of this. It also comes out of the disintegration of the sort of Jewish societal lifestyle, like living in the shtetls, where you have all these different figures. You have the barchen and you have the cobbler. Many of these people urbanize. They get jobs in factories, and Jewish shtetl life, as we know it, somewhat disintegrates. And so the Purim Shpiel, as something that really emerges from that life, fades along with it. Yiddish modernist theater comes of age, and theatrical performances for Jews by Jews in Yiddish, in Polish, in other languages, in German as well, become one of the defining features of Eastern European Jewish culture until the Second World War. This is really what defines the culture of Jewish Europe, not just theater, but literature and art and other forms of other artistic expression, is really what defines popular Jewish culture from in the interwar period. The Purim Shpiel never entirely disappears. It's always a feature of Purim celebrations, always. But the Purim Shpiel in the Jewish imagination begins, the old Purim Shpiel, right? Although it fades from view, begins to take on new form. For some Yiddish writers, for instance, it becomes the subject of modernist poetry that sought to revisit and revise traditional Jewish texts and to reread them in modern terms. And so the most famous of these, I think you'd agree with me, is Itzik Manger's Megillah Lieder, probably one of the most famous Purim Shpiels in Yiddish today. It's from 1936. He published it in 1936. What it is a reimagining of the Megillah set in the 19th century, where running under the story of the Megillah, the well-known story that we all know, is another story, which is the tragedy of Fatrigoso, the tailor who's madly in love with Queen Esther, and with whom Esther is also madly in love. There's an assassination attempt that Fatrigoso unsuccessfully makes on Achashverosh's life. He's hanged for it, which creates a whole nother emotional dimension to like the world of the palace, right? The world of Achashverosh, the world of certainly of Esther. And, Munger's characters, they come from his own life and experience. There's the master tailor von Fosse, there's the tailor's apprentice, Fatrigoso, who's this tragic, romantic figure. And in the process of telling this sort of untold story, which in the prologue to the Megillah Lieder, the poems of the Megillah, in the prologue, Munger writes, I'm telling you the untold story. I'm telling you the story that the official chroniclers of the Megillah have left out. And in the process of telling this untold story, he illuminates elements of the Megillah characters, of their inner worlds that we would otherwise miss, that otherwise we wouldn't know about, right? And so here's a great example. This is one of the poems from the Megillah Lieder. Oopsie, bear with me. And I'll just read I'll read a little bit of it in Yiddish and I'll read most of it in English. Die Malke sitzt in Bläusen Hemd, der Goldener in der Früh, Stift mit der Strahl von ihrer Haar und lenkt ihm ihr über die Knie. Verschämt sich die Malke und sie sagt, weg, du Asusnik, du. Gei, stift mit meiner Diensten in Kich, nor die Malke los Ruh. So you hear there's a rhythm, it rhymes. This is very characteristic of not just the Megillah Lieder that Munger wrote, but also of his Chumash Lieder, the plays that were his sort of biblical reimaginings of his poetic reimaginings of the biblical stories, very rhythmic and with wonderful rhyme schemes, very playful language. So wearing her nightshirt, Queen Vashti sits, the morning is bright and fair. She dandles a sunbeam on her knee, then lets it play in her hair. Vashti's embarrassed and she says, go away, you impudent thing, play with the kitchen servant girls, but stay away from the queen. Pretending he doesn't understand, the sunbeam, that little flirt, slips for an instant down her neck and gambols about in her shirt. She trembles and dreads to think that what her husband, that simpleton, would do if he knew that she, the queen, had toyed with a common man. That's only half the poem. And now you're getting a real insight into Queen Vashti, who only plays such a small role in the story of the Megillah before she's banished from the kingdom. you get a real insight to, she's a real person with feelings. She's not happy in this marriage to Achashverosh. She toyed with a common man. She's had an affair. You get these amazing, these dimensions that come out. Of course, they're fictional, but so is the Megillah, right? And so the Megillah allows for this kind of, for stretching the story in this way. I should say this translation it's by Leonard Wolf. It comes from a beautiful translated edition of collected work by Itzik Manger called The World According to Itzik. And I highly recommend it. We can put it in the chat later on later on. It's excellent. It's a great way to be introduced to the work of Itzik Manger in English if you're not familiar with it in Yiddish already. I want to show you a bit of a clip from a film from 1937 called Der Purim Shpiel. Itzik Manger was involved in the writing of this script. It's not exactly his script, but he was involved in the writing of it. I should also say that Itzik Manger was kind of a very fanciful poet. He was really interested in reviving the folk culture of traditional Jewish society that by the time he was born around 1901 was beginning to fade and change. And he was really interested in reviving this. And so the Purim Shpiel for him is this incredibly deep well of inspiration for Jewish folk culture. And he sees it as almost the paradigmatic example of pure and pristine Jewish folk culture. And that's why he gets so involved in it. And so he's interested in helping to write a movie called The Purim Shpieler and writing his Megillah Lieder. So let's see if I can, forgive me, the subtitles are difficult to see at times, but what you see here is the Purim Shpielers coming in, they start performing the Purim play, everybody's enjoying, and toward the end, one of the Purim Shpielers gets a little bit carried away with the insults that they're hurling. It stops being so playful and starts to be a little bit starts to be hurtful, and the Purim Shpiel is sort of ruined by him. But let's listen. Let's watch. Hang on. Let's get this playing. There we are.
Thank you for doing this today.
Purim, meine Liebelein, wir wollen also spielen, ein Spiel will mein. Achashverosh war Amelech HaGroße, hat lieb gehabt Weibele, und ist Feind gehabt kein Kreuz. Was will ihr? Am aufgewitzten Häuserkönig, wie so sein wir in der Welt. Zuckst wie hoch, zuckst wie nicht, heißt die Nacht jetzt auf die Zeit. Die Rapsile, Adave, Aquare, in Green Begrüß. Die Augen sind immer hier, Kossoke, in die Hand Rodat gehäuft der Nur. Ja, schlimmer Saul, die Teisiene, weil die Schäppe des Gästehler zu der Schreine. In wie alles schlägt man auf der Appetit. Jede Woche man darf sie an einem Paris. Wie heißt die Psyle?
Esther! Wie steht in der Medil?
Esther, die bist mir gefällt, ohne Wege verriebelt.
Ach, was gefällt dir? Mit Reis!
Moment! Moment! Zum Schauen der Hund! Zum Schauen der Hund! Zum Belusen der Trompet! Zum Los der Trompet! Ich nehme sie, als ob sie steht und geht. Achtung, soll sein mit Gift! Sie bist noch Wochen, sie bist der Minister. Wer ist wegen der Lang in der Hippe standen?
Hey, Rosa! Der Land in der Rippe standen!
Mama, weil du nicht du? Ja, dann sitzt er doch da, zwischen den Gassen und trinkt und frisst. Asa Huse, Asa Chitzme für ein Purim Shpiel. Luchen und verbeten. Purim Shpiel, sie sollen Häuser machen. Aschisten, was Aschisten? Ach, Chitzme für ein Purim Shpiel, was? Es gefällt doch nicht, dass mich alle Zeit hat. Noch hier und so eine Bier, mit Chitzme. Aschisten bleibt Aschisten. Es gefällt ihm nicht, der Schiste. Aber der Namen von dem Schiste steht der Mond in seinem Wind. Aschiste bleibt Aschiste. Wenn mich alle zu Ziegeil, aber bei der Warten, bis nur ein silliger Namen, bis nur der Krippe, dann wird der Streck gewesen. Aschiste bleibt Aschiste.
Okay, I'm going to stop it there for the sake of time. I'm seeing some questions in the chat. This film should be available to watch in entirety. I believe it has been restored. It's a good question where, and I'll have to think about that. But yes, it certainly is available in its entirety. The question is whether the restoring institution has released it to libraries and things like that. And I don't know the answer to that. I can find out. This is a film. Yeah, it's from Poland. It's 1937. It was a time of a really generative time for Yiddish film in Poland. And it's also a place where Yiddish film also was one of these places where the Jewish folk culture was recorded in. They staged dancing, they hired choreographers who could really stage the dancing that was so evocative of the shtetl, the Purim Shpiel that was so evocative of the shtetl, and so on. It's one of our most valuable assets when it comes to researching, what was this life like? What was this world like? Let's revive it. Film is one of our best tools. I'm going to go back into I have a few pictures here I just wanted to quickly show you that come from the Ontario Jewish Archives, since it is Purim after all. These are some local pictures of really fun costumes and just people having a great time. Before I get to the last part of my presentation today. And some kids. Who doesn't love kids in costume? Nestor Humman with his big hat. And there they are. Okay. I want to conclude in the next few minutes by talking about the war and post-war periods for Purim Shpielen. Purim Shpielen, immediately, this is before World War I. You can see Purim Shpielen were being put on. This is a part of the culture. These are notices from Vilna. Immediately following the war, of course, the Purim Shpielen found heavy resonance between the Purim story and the near destruction of the Jews that they had just experienced, with Hitler standing in as the modern day Haman, the Haman of their day. There were Purim Shpiels performed during the war in order to, I guess, to entertain children in ghettos, for example. And I have a few pictures of that. Immediately after the war, survivors, this is from a DP camp in 1946 in Landsberg. The Purim Shpiels that survivors in DP camps, for example, put on often took the form of revenge fantasies, right, against Hitler. So, for example, here they have created a mock tombstone for Hitler, and they're going to burn. I believe there's something in the center that they're going to set on fire. They're going to burn that, and that's part of their revenge fantasy. I think this play actually staged the death of Hitler. Somebody played Hitler, and you got to hand it to these survivors. They were very tough. This is a Purim text from 1943, a Shpiel, written by Tzvi Herschel Weiss, who was a prisoner in a work camp. He wrote this for the enjoyment of himself and his fellow prisoners. This is held at Yad Vashem. And this is a Shpiel he wrote incorporating elements of his modern day, his own destruction, his own oppression, the Haman of his own, his own life, his own experience. And yeah, here's a Purim play being held in a ghetto, and there are children performing on the stage. So Purim remained a source of enjoyment and levity, even for those imprisoned in ghettos and later on in DP camps. There are, Yad Vashem, I want to also say, has a beautiful online exhibition, a mini exhibition of Purim before, during, and after the war that I highly recommend. I will also put that link in the chat, and I recommend you check it out, full of beautiful photos and artifacts. Today, the Purim Shpiel mocks current events. I'm sure you've seen Purim Shpiels in synagogues and community centers. Current events, celebrities, well-known community members. One can order, in fact, pre-written Purim Shpiel scripts with songs, with titles like Oklahoma and Middle East Side Story, based on Broadway musicals, of course. I attended one last night that was Mama Megillah reading. Mama Megillah, I think it was, Mamma Mia, an ABBA inspired. Then here you go. This is the website, purimshpiels.com. You can actually order scripts. You can listen to clips of the songs. And this is the Purim Shpiel of today. Another Purim Shpiel of today, and I want to just end with this. Just play this for a couple of minutes for you. It's a brilliant, I think, virtual, pandemic-friendly staging of Itzik Manger's Megillah Lieder from last year, from 2021, Purim last year. It was produced by the Congress for Jewish Culture and the Arbitering, the Workers' Circle. It's beautifully done with great Yiddish actors of today. And I just wanted to play you a few seconds of it. It's sort of done bilingually in Yiddish and in English. And I just want to give you a taste of it. This you can readily find. It's over an hour long. It's on YouTube. And I will put the link for this one in the chat as well. Let's see, I may have to do this again. Here we go.
Good people, I'll tell you a story of heroes and villains, of sorrows and glory. It's called the Megillah, this story of old. But in Itzik Manger's Megillah, when the tailors of his village tell it, it's told as it ought to be told. There will be King Achashverosh with his red wine-pickled nose. There will be Vashti's queen, who wouldn't take off her clothes. There's Mordechai, the wise one, the wheeler and the dealer, and Esther, the ripe fruit of Judah. What man wouldn't die just to peel it? And of course there is Haman, unspeakable Haman, so mean and so sneaky and gruff that no matter how deep he lies buried, it will never be deep enough. Seid ihr jeden schauen still, gefangen an dem Purim Shpiel. A Purim Shpiel in Gramen, was hat 1000 Tage. Wer es wird es lehnen, wird wie a Biber weinen. Und wer es wird es hören, wird lachen mit Tränen. Und gehen sie alle stille, die Helden von der Megille. Ach, schwerst der König, was wieviel trinkt, ist ihm wenig.
Esther Amalke die Grine. In Vashti in der Krenoline.
Odge de Chuchematik. In Humenarusche, der Latte.
Sehr ist die Machschefe, wo schelt wie am Gefe.
Weil Susu der Redaktor, was hat der Scheinig hat der?
Now you might say,
I'm going to stop it there. Now at least you've been introduced to the cast, but I'm going to stop it there. I'm going to stop sharing my screen as well. And I want to thank you so much for your attention, for your wonderful comments in the chat. I'm just catching up now. And for joining us today for a dive into the Purim Shpiel. And I'm going to turn it now back over to Lisa for Q&A. Thank you so much. Shine Dank.
Shane Dunk, Miriam, what a treat this has been. So I just want to mention something to all of you good people. I came up with this crazy idea for this topic. This is not a presentation that existed before. This was not research that Miriam just had in her back pocket that she could pull out. So I think that this was a tall order from the start. Miriam, I think I can speak for everybody. We are blown away by the level of detail, the research, the work, the photos, the visual art, the audio recordings, the film recordings. This is, it's a really fascinating little known piece of history. And I come from a theater background. And so that was why I thought that this might make an interesting lecture. And I really want to thank you on behalf of everybody here from the bottom of my heart. Maybe I'm allowed to disclose that Miriam Kanenohora is a new mother on top of everything else. So she took this on top of everything that she dealt with at home. And I am so grateful. We are so grateful. Please join me in a well-deserved round of applause for Miriam Borden.
Oh,
amazing.
Thank you very, very much. Thank you so much.
I want to just thank everybody who have typed the questions in the chat. Just in the essence of time, I'm going to read through some of them just so we can try to get to as many as possible. Okay, so the one question that came in from Ellen Morris was, what was the average length of a Purim Shpiel? She was asking, was it maybe an hour or less? Could you just speak to that briefly, Miriam?
That's a very, very good question. The problem is that we don't have recordings, right, of these. So I guess it would depend on the problem is that we don't have recordings. And also, from what I understand, that the improvisational nature of the Purim Shpiel, the sort of cut and paste nature, the way performers really had carte blanche to do what they wanted in the course of a Purim Shpiel. So I suppose a Purim Shpiel could be 5 minutes long, could be an hour. And I suppose anything in between. I can't really, that's just what I would imagine. I can't really answer that question. I wish I could. If only we had recordings to tell us what it was really like.
Okay, I think that's great.
Question.
I think that's a great, and the fact that you gave those like eyewitness accounts of what was happening, I think that gives us a good flavor.
Great.
Judith was asking about the development of the women's involvement and their roles in the Purim Shpiel. If you could just speak to that for a minute, that would be great.
Yeah. So again, I don't know too much about this, but I would assume, based on what I do know about the Yiddish theater, which was full of women actors, it's being a modernist theater in the 20th century, I would assume we know that the until the Yiddish theater, it was mostly men performing the Purim Shpiel. Part of that is, all of it, I would say, is cultural. It's societal. It's that it was in more religious societies. It's just not tznius. It's not modest for women, certainly to sing. To hear a woman's voice, singing voice is forbidden, right, by halacha, by the rabbis. But in addition, it's just seen as not so modest for a woman to be an actor, to put herself out there in that way, until modern theater really upends everything we thought we knew about performance. And so I think it's probably, although there are some instances, like I said, of acrobatic performers and dancers who would make appearances in Purim plays, I think it would have been a case-by-case basis of what's the temperature of the culture in that particular town, in that particular region, until we get to the modern period when women are on stage just as much as men are.
Excellent. Okay, great question. Thank you for that answer. Jordan has asked a really great question. He's wondering if you've seen any references to children going house to house as Purim Spielers in the memoirs from Eastern Europe, whether this tradition is unique to North America, like a parallel to Halloween. He's mentioning that even this morning in an area of Toronto, he could see the children parading. So could you just answer that?
Yeah, sure. We certainly have evidence in the memoirs of children running after the Purim Spielers, entertained by them, and wanting to be part of the fun. So there's that. In terms of being cast in the plays, I don't know. I suppose if there were a really talented child who could sing well or was a great comic actor, I don't see why they wouldn't be cast. But it seems, I wish I could say, this is the thing, that so many of his memoirs, Jordan, as you know, still have yet to be read and have yet to be translated and yet to be researched. So I guess that's work for me and you, Jordan. That's work we've cut our work out for ourselves. But yeah, I'm sorry I missed that this morning in that Lawrence and Bathurst area. It sounds great.
It does sound great. And you know what, I have to say that I have Deanna and I will, and Ellen, who is here with us, will have very fond memories of the preschool children at the JCC. They would come through the admin wing when we were in the building, and they would, shake their Gregors and have their costumes. So they're doing it in the building, or they did it this morning. And Alavai, we look forward to seeing it again next year. So
my friend Lillian Rosenblum, I just want to say, has just reminded me that Andre Granat was a child performer in Hungary, I believe. So yes, indeed, and is still alive today, alive and well. So yes, indeed, in times, that we can, in living memory, we have children who were cast in Purim plays in the old country. So thank you for that, Lillian. I really appreciate it.
Amazing. So before I wrap up, I know, listen, when we have these really juicy, in Yiddish, I'll say geschmacke, delicious topics, I know we just want more and more, but my friends, time goes when you're learning and enjoying. So I am going to wrap up, but what I just wanted to say, Miriam, rather than putting the links in the chat, if it's okay, we often do this. Wonderful Deanna will be sending all of you the recording of today's presentation. Many of you have asked in the chat, are we able to share it with family and friends? Because this is a free event, I am happy to say, yes, you may. And when we send out the recording, Miriam, if you can just email us any links that you think might be pertinent, and then we'll make sure that those links get to all of you good folks for extra learning, okay? So I just wanted to thank Miriam Borden again so very much for such a wonderful way for us to celebrate Purim. And again, my heartfelt thank you. There she is, Cyril Troster, and to Vivian Felsen and the UJA Committee for Yiddish. It's always my great pleasure to partner and collaborate with you folks. So I want to let you know that it's spring. It's like around the corner. We can taste it. And that means that I have a whole crop of new virtual goodies coming. So I just wanted to give you a little taste to whet your appetites. So from Gilgamesh to Gucci, the what, why, and where WEAR of clothing throughout history. That is a 3-part series with award-winning set lighting costume designer Philip Silver. That begins on Monday, April the 4th. We have a very special lecture that commemorates Beverly Fingerhut, the wonderful community lay leader who used to lead our book club. This lecture is called Peggy Guggenheim and her impact on 20th century art. And the guest speaker is from England. Her name is Alexandra Epps. She's the official guide and lecturer at Tate Modern and Tate Britain. This should be very special. It's going to be the afternoon of Thursday, April the 7th. We will be commemorating Yom HaShoah, Holocaust Remembrance Day, on Thursday, April the 28th, with author Frank Flynn discussing his new novel, Songs of the Sabbath. We continue offering our monthly book club, our monthly movement and dance with Shoshana, and our biweekly senior support group. For information about any of these adult daytime programs, please send an email to my wonderful JCC colleague, Deanna D. Lello. She has typed her email address into the chat. And I really want to thank everybody for all of your wonderful positive comments in the chat. We save those. Those are really important for us, for our donors and for our impact reporting. So we love them. Please send us emails, and I thank you all for being here this afternoon. So on behalf of myself and Deanna and everybody at the Miles Nadal JCC, it was so wonderful celebrating Purim with all of you this afternoon. Again, for those of you who celebrate Purim, I want to wish you a Chag Sameach and a good Yontef. I look forward to the day, Alavai, when we will do this in person at the Miles Nadal JCC Bashana Haba'ah. I hope
because
to see you. Oh, Ellen, please, Ellen, who